Welcome to Brainstem. Today we'll be learning about the anatomy of the nervous system. Our brains are very powerful, so powerful that we are privileged to even comprehend a fraction of its immense complexity. And here in this image, you can see the magic school bus exploring the brain. So that's what we'll be learning about today. So today we'll be learning about the different regions and parts of the brain. Our brains are finely tuned, interconnected systems full of all types of surprises. In order to learn about the different parts of the brain, you first need to learn about the coordinates or the directions associated with the brain itself. So, the coordinates of the brain involve the different directions in the brain. So, here are some of the directions that we'll be talking about. So, the Z direction is top and bottom, the X direction is right and left, and finally, the Y direction is front and back of the brain. So the first two coordinates we'll be talking about are the superior and inferior parts of the brain. So just as an example, for most people, chocolate cake, which is on the left, is tastier than fruit cake, which is on the right, which essentially makes chocolate cake superior and fruit cake inferior. So essentially, chocolate cake is better than fruit cake or above fruit cake, and it's the same in the brain, as superior means above and inferior means below. Next, we'll be talking about the anterior and posterior coordinates of the brain. So as an example, ants' antennae are positioned on the front of their body. And an easy way to remember this is by hearing antennae and anterior. They sound really similar. So essentially, anterior means the front of the brain. So next, the opposite of anterior is posterior. So this is where posteriors are in their behind. So posterior means behind, the behind of the brain, or opposite of anterior. So this is on the opposite side of the antennae in the ant body. Next, we'll be talking about rostral and caudal coordinates in the brain. So as an example, we can take a little detour and talk about sports. So most sporting teams use a roster with a list of the names of every player on the team. And this roster is read before or in front of the start of every game to make sure each player is where they need to be. So you can think of the rostral coordinate as in front, because the roster or the rostral is read in front of each game. The opposite of rostral is caudal. Caudal rhymes with bottle, and athletes drink from Gatorade bottles, like the one on the right, at the end of their games or the back of their games. So you think of caudal as behind, or the behind of the brain. So next, we'll be learning about the dorsal and ventral coordinates of the brain. So essentially, dorsal refers to the top of the brain, like the dorsal fin on top of a dolphin, like you can see on the left, whereas ventral is the opposite and it refers to the bottom of the brain, or the bottom part of the brain, like a vent pushing air to the bottom of a room, as you can see in the right.
So next, we'll be moving on from the coordinates of the brain and talking about the regions of the brain. This material is a bit complex, so we're going to do our best to try to help you understand this really amazing material. So here's an overview of 4 of the main regions, regions of the brain, and an additional 5th back here. Here's the frontal lobe at the front, the parietal lobe at the top, the occipital lobe at the back, and the temporal lobe at the bottom. Down here is the cerebellum. So the frontal and parietal lobes are separated here because they're both near the front compared to the other parts. So the frontal lobe is at the front of the brain. But you can remember this by associating frontal and front, since they both sound very similar. And this region of the brain is important for language function, voluntary movement, and higher level executive functions, such as thought, emotions, and even your personality. The parietal lobe is behind the frontal lobe. It is posterior to the frontal lobe, which is something we discovered a few slides ago. And this region of the brain has a completely different set of functions. So it's responsible for touch sensation, general sensation, more other sensations, limb positions, and transmittance of spatial information of motor systems to the body. Here is the temporal and occipital lobe. So the temporal lobe is near the trunk of the brain. It's at the bottom. He's associated with trunk, which is at the back. So this here is at the bottom. And they both start with T. So the function of this is to process auditory information, which means it just functions to process information from your ears so you can hear, actually. It also includes memory into the information into the brain. And also the occipital lobe is you can remember it easily by remembering that it's on the opposite side of the frontal lobe. Opposite and occipital both start with O. So this is a way that you can try to remember the position of the occipital lobe. And its function is to visualize color and perception, in addition to motion. And it processes motion, giving people the ability to see movement rather than like still images like old movies. And here is the cerebellum. The cerebellum it means little brain in Latin. You can think of it as like a mini brain below the occipital lobe, but it's still part of the brain, so keep that in mind. It's not like a separate thing. And this part of the brain is important for motor learning and for your balance. You would not be able to ride a bike or like walk without falling over without the cerebellum. So this is a very important part of your brain.
All right, so next we'll be learning about the subdivisions of the central nervous system. Now, there are two main subdivisions of the central nervous system. The brain, that's the upper part, and then the spinal cord, it's right below it. The purpose of the upper brain is to coordinate and integrate signals to and from multiple body regions, and to control human behavior. The purpose of the spinal cord is to route spinal nerves in 31 segments and 4 divisions, perceive sensory info from the body, control basic reflexes, and also generate rhythmic motor sequences, which basically means help move your body. All right, so your brain has 12 special cranial nerves with 12 special functions. A cool way to remember these is by thinking of one of these cool mnemonics. So the first one is on old Olympus, towering top, Finn and German viewed some hops. The second is oh, to touch and feel very good velvet, such heaven. Now, my favorite is the first one because that's the one my neuroscience teacher taught me, but I think that you should use whichever one helps you the most. So let's go through what each of these words stand for. So the first O refers to the olfactory nerve, which is the first cranial nerve. The second one is the optic nerve. The third is the oculomotor nerve. The fourth is the trochlear nerve. The fifth is the trigeminal nerve. The sixth is the abducens nerve. The seventh is the facial nerve. The eighth is the auditory nerve. The ninth is the glossopharyngeal nerve. The 10th is the vagus nerve. And the 11th is the spinal accessory nerve. And the 12th is the hypoglossal nerve. So now the next logical step is to talk about your spinal cord, because that's right under your brain, and that's the lower half of the central nervous system. So your spinal cord is broken down into 4 distinct regions. The cervical region, that's at the very top. And then right below that is the thoracic region. Then under that is the lumbar region. And then finally under that is the sacral region. Each of these regions corresponds to a special function in your body. Now, your cervical region has nerves that go out into the upper part of your body, like your neck and shoulders. The thoracic region nerves go out into your chest. The lumbar region nerves go out into your waist, and the sacral region nerves go down into your legs.
All right, so now we'll just go over everything that we learned today. So I know there's a lot to cover, but hopefully you remember some of it. So First, we'll go over the coordinates of the brain. So just as a short review, the main coordinates you should remember is the superior, which means above, inferior, which means below. As well, you could remember the anterior part of the brain, which means in front of, and the posterior part of the brain, which is behind the brain. Then you should remember the rostral part of the brain, which is also more in front, but a little more diagonal. Then caudal, which is the opposite, but also in that behind diagonal part of the brain. And then finally, you can learn about the dorsal and ventral parts of the brain. So dorsal is the top part of the brain, and ventral is the bottom part.
There's a little review of the regions of the brain. Here we have the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, vector-occipital lobe. Here under most things is the temporal lobe, and right below everything else, it's not labeled here, but it's the cerebellum. So as a review of the functions of all these, you can go back to the recording of the video and watch it again.
All right, then finally, I wanted to remind y'all how to remember the cranial nerves. So you can think of one of these two mnemonics. The first, again, is on old Olympus towering top, thin in German, eat some hops. The second is oh, 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 to touch and feel, very good velvet, such heaven. And these mnemonics can help you remember these 12 cranial nerves.
Thank you for listening to our lesson, and we hope you learned a lot about the brain and the different parts of the nervous system. Bye.